Hi, I am going to tell you guys a little bit more about genetics. So last time we talked in very broad terms about what a gene is, what a trait is, and now we're going to really go and delve into the science of genetics. So let's first define what genetics is. So genetics is the study of heredity, the study of how genes are passed from parents to their children or to their offspring, which is a scientific name. So basically, a lot of scientists and individuals in the past have seen that there are children who look exactly like their parents, and there are children who look nothing like their parents. And there's, of course, most of you who are somewhere in between. And they started wondering why. And why does something skip a generation? And what is it inside of us that makes us look the way we look? So that's what we're going to be studying. So first, we need to come up with some vocabulary before we do this. So you guys should be copying this down. Pause me if you need to take some time to write something. Write down questions that you might have, even those questions that might not have to do with specifically this, but those interesting questions that you would maybe raise your hand for in class and be like, is this why this happens? Okay, I want those questions. I want you to write down those questions because those questions represent your thinking. So, every organism, whether it's a tiny microscopic bacteria, or whether it's you or an elephant or a tree outside, has genes, has DNA that tells it to look the way it does. Okay? And what we call, us as humans have very different genes than plants or than even something like an elephant or a giraffe or a bacteria. We call that a genome. We use the term genome. And what a genome is a genome is all of the genetic information of an organism. Then you guys will remember, okay, this is either half from mom and half from dad, or this genetic information comes from itself. So sometimes some organisms, they make copies of themselves. So sometimes that genetic information, oops, I forgot to put that on, hold on a second. Half from mom, half from dad. So sometimes organisms, not like us, but other organisms, reproduce on their own, like a bacteria, okay? So they get it from, they reproduce by themselves by copying themselves. For instance, sometimes we'll have an organism and it'll just divide into two. And so in that case, the genetic information it has is a copy of itself. So these are the two things that can happen. Okay, we of course are sexual beings, amoebas and some types of bacteria, and single-celled organisms are asexual, meaning we just make a copy. They're not very exciting. We in biology like to look at more exciting ones. Hold on a second. So let's talk about genome. How do we represent this genetic information? How do we represent? We represent this genetic information this genetic information. My highlighting tool is not working. So this genetic information, what is this? What is genetic information? What are the different forms? So I want you to write down all the different things that we can use to refer to genetic information. And think about what we learned about last time. What are all the different forms of genetic information we have inside ourselves. So, all of that genetic information is DNA, genes, or chromosomes. When we're talking about genetic information, we're talking about any of those. So you may be wondering, why do I have a picture of all these different organisms on the bottom of this page? So we're going to talk about the genetic information in all of them. So how many chromosomes does a human have? You guys should know this. 46 chromosomes. Okay? A human has 46 chromosomes. A human also has, you might not have known this, 25,000 genes. Okay? And it has billions of DNA pairs. Okay? We're going to learn about that a little later. Okay? Does anyone know what this is? Look at this picture over here and see what you think this is. This is a fruit fly. This is what we'll be breathing when we come back from spring break. A fruit fly has 8 chromosomes, let's go to CHR, and it has around 13,000 genes. So it has almost 50% of our genes. Yeah, it's much simpler than that. And these genes are the same. Like, we don't have genes for wings, okay? We have genes for large brains, but we don't have genes for wings, okay? This is something called a roundworm, okay? A roundworm is kind of gross, really tiny. You can actually get roundworm. And roundworm has 12 chromosomes, and it has 19,000 genes. So a roundworm has almost as many genes as that. It's not really about how many genes you have, but about what those genes code for, what traits those genes code for. This is a mouse, and this mouse has 40 chromosomes, and it has the same amount of genes as this, 25,000 genes. So there are species of corn that have 50,000 genes. There are ferns, or types of plants, that have over 100,000 genes. So even though we think we're the most complicated organisms, there are all these other organisms that are complicated as well. So let's talk a little bit more about these genes. So this is some pictures of chromosomes, but in order to understand what chromosomes do, we have to learn a little bit more about genes. And gene, as you remember from your notes last time, is a piece of DNA that codes for a specific trait. So not all genes are the same. So we use this word allele to help us understand genes. Allele is an alternative form of a gene. So this means, okay, for hair color, or not exactly hair color, but for hitchhiker's thumb, which was what we did in that survey the other day, okay, there is a allele for a hitchhiker's thumb, and there's an allele for no hitchhiker's thumb. So you either get the allele or you don't get the allele. Okay? Sometimes you have alleles that don't express themselves. And that's because you get one set of genes from your parent, one parent, and one set of genes from the other parent. So here we have all the chromosomes in the human body. This is kind of cool because this is different colors. So we're going to pretend we zoom in on this one. So if we zoom in on this one, we go over here. Okay, this is a chromosome. Now there are 20,000 genes, 25,000 genes. They're all stuck in all these little chromosomes. So that's the way they do that is that they kind of like stack up. So let's say we have the allele for hitchhiker's thumb over here. We'll call it an H. You also have 2 alleles for every gene. You have an allele for hitchhiker's thumb over here, and you have it over here as part of the chromosome. Then maybe you have an allele for freckles. Okay, so you have a segment of DNA that codes for freckles or no freckles right over here. Then think of another hereditary trait, like for example, having lactose intolerance. Okay, so we're going to do it, okay? And you don't always get the same alleles from each parent. You could have the allele for being right-handed, okay? And do you guys notice how I'm drawing some as capital letters and some as uppercase letters? You can have an allele for, think of other genetic traits. Other genetic traits would be having having dwarfism. So I'm going to make these go lowercase, okay? Or having a gene or allele for being let's say we're doing flat-footed. So let me make this an O. So you have all these different genes. Every single one of these chromosomes has tens and thousands of alleles on it. If you add them up, you'd have around 25,000 different alleles. Okay? So in order to understand alleles a little bit more, we're going to go to the next page. Okay? So you have different alleles. And when we write the genome of an organism, we look at one gene, okay? So when writing the alleles, writing the genome, no. We only look at one gene. So for instance, we're going to do something like lactose intolerance. So lactose intolerance is something called a recessive disorder. And that means that you can have the gene for it and not actually have it. The other gene overpowers it, the dominant gene. So if you have a parent and they have this, they have one gene from their mother, one allele from their mother, and then they have one allele from their dad, okay? You can look at the genome, so we have this over here, you can look at this and you can say, do these alleles match up or do they not match up? And if they do match up, we call it homozygous. This is a vocabulary word you need to know. Homozygous is when an individual has two of the same alleles. Okay? Each letter is an allele, as you can see. Okay? Homozygous is when an individual has two of the same alleles. So there's another example of a homozygous writing. We could make it a lowercase L, two lowercase L. Then what's the opposite? So there's different, and that's called heterozygous. Heterozygous is, these are important, I'm going to underline this, when an individual has different alleles. So an example of that would be big H, little h. Okay, they have different alleles. Big L, little L. So we're gonna look at this a little bit more. Okay? So first you have to know there's a difference between, we're gonna look at this. So I'm gonna put some on the board. Okay? Number 1, big H. Number 2, little l. Number 3, big R, little r. Number 4, and I want you to tell me, are they homozygous or heterozygous? Okay? So take a second and just pause the video and write for each one of these whether they're homozygous or heterozygous. Okay? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm going to go through it. So this one is homo, so check yourself. I'm just going to write HOM. This one is homo. So I've gone ahead and written every single one. Check yourself, see if you're right. Okay? So now there are different terms for each of these. Okay? So something, a genotype, okay, is the type of genes an organism has. So an example would be big H, little h, okay? Or little h, or big H, big H. A phenotype are the physical, right? Remember this by pH, the physical features of an organism. Or the behaviors, okay? The traits. So this is what you can observe and what you see. So you guys all know your you all know your phenotypes. but you don't know your genotypes because you've never looked at your genes before. Okay, that's what we might be doing a little bit on field trip on Friday. So we know the phenotype, an example would be hair color. Okay, having a disease. Certain diseases are genetic. Okay, and you may have it. Okay, another example would be, let's say this is a survey, tongue curling. These are phenotypes. Okay. So we will practice that a little bit more tomorrow. So you know what homozygous is, you know what heterozygous is, you know what genotype and phenotype are. Let's talk a little bit more about how we determine phenotype. So I'm going to give you an example. So for example, let's say that dwarfism is a dominant characteristic. So this means that if you have the gene for dwarfism, it overpowers the other gene. So that means if you have big D, little d, or big B, big D, these were the genotypes, okay, your phenotype would be that you're a dwarf. And this is actually true. Dwarfism is a genetic disorder. Okay? If you have, let's say, lactose intolerance, if you had someone with a genotype little g, their phenotype would be normal stature. So normal height, no disease. Okay? The capital letters represent the dominant gene. The lowercase letters represent the recessive gene. We're going to write that down. Capital letters equals dominant. Okay? And then lowercase equals recessive. Okay? This is what helps us to kind of determine the phenotype. Looking at the genotype, it also helps us determine if people are carriers for diseases. So for example, sickle cell anemia is recessive. Okay, so we'll do this. Sickle cell anemia. And this is all true genetic information. Okay, sickle cell anemia is genetic. It's genetic and is a recessive disorder. So does that mean that sickle cell anemia is a strong gene or a weak gene? A weak gene. Okay? So if you have big X, little x, do you have sickle cell anemia? No. No sickle cell. Okay? But you are something called a carrier. Meaning you carry the disease and you can pass it on to your children. Okay? If you're big S, these are big S's, you have no sickle cell. Okay? And if you're little s, do you have sickle cell? Yes, you have sickle cell. That is your phenotype. So this is your genotype, this is your phenotype. Okay, I hope this helps make sense. We're going to practice a little bit tomorrow. I want you to go back and review. So we have genetics, we have genome, and we gave some examples. Okay, we have an allele, which is an alternative form of a gene. So you have tons of different alleles. You get one allele from your mom and one allele from your dad for each trait you have. You have heterozygous and homozygous. So these are their important words. So you need to know these, heterozygous and homozygous. And we did some examples. And then you have genotype and phenotype. Okay, I hope you guys enjoyed, and please write down any questions or points of clarification, things you want me to clear up tomorrow. Thank you. Thank you.